Hi, this is Rob. Welcome back to Cumulus Cycles and another CSS tutorial. In this video, we'll be using CSS to position the HTML elements on our web page. We'll start by looking at the W3 Schools pages on CSS float and clear properties. Float and clear are used to specify how an element and its content should float or be positioned on the page, and which elements and their content can be placed beside the element which is floated. We can see from this page that float is used for positioning and formatting content. For example, the float property can be used to wrap text around an image. If we scroll down to this example, we'll see that the image is floated to the right of the text. Let's jump in to try it yourself and take a look at the code. So in the HTML, they've added a paragraph with some text at the top of the page. They've added another paragraph tag which contains an image and some lorem ipsum text. In the CSS style, they've added an image selector with a float property and its value set to right. So this says look for the HTML image element and float it to the right of the display area. So even though the image tag comes before the text in its paragraph, because it's floated to the right on the page, it is displayed to the right of the text. If we change the value of the float property to none, we'll get the default value where the image displays first and then the text comes after it. If we set float to left and run, now we see that the image is still displayed on the left, but that the text is pulled up just to the right of the image. Now, let's take a look at the clear property. And as we can see from this page, the clear property specifies what should happen with elements that are placed next to floating elements. And the clear property could have several values. Looking at the left and right, we see that if the clear is set to left, this will push the element below any other elements which are floated left. And if the value is right, it'll push the content below any elements which are floated right. So let's jump down into the try it yourself example and take a look at their code. So in the HTML, they've started with a div with a class of div1, followed by a div with a class of div2. And if we look at those styles, we'll see that div1 is floated left and div2 has no clear. So in the results, if we look at this, we'll see that div2 comes directly after div1, which is what we would expect looking at the HTML and knowing that they've floated div1 to the left of the display area. Now, if we look at the HTML for the second example here, they once again have a div, this time with a class of div3, followed by another div with text with a class of div4. So again, div3 has a style which is floated left. Div4 has a clear property also set to left. So in the results, when this is run, div3 is displayed floated to the left of the display area. Then div4 is cleared left. So clear everything that comes after div3 and position div4 to the left of the display area. Now, let's switch over to Visual Studio Code and apply these properties to our own HTML elements and see what they look like in the browser. Looking at the HTML for this page, you'll see that I have 3 paragraph tags. Each paragraph contains an image and some text. In the CSS, I've applied some styles to the paragraph and I've set the width and height of the images. The difference between these 3 paragraph examples is in the class attribute value for the image. The first image has a class of no float. And if we look at the CSS for no float, we've set the float properties value to none. So if we look at this in the browser, we'll see that the image is placed first, followed by the text in the paragraph, which is what we would expect because the image is placed before the text inside of the paragraph in the HTML. The second example floats the image to the left of the rest of the content, which is contained within its parent paragraph. We could see that in the code that this image has a class attribute value of float left. And in the CSS, we see that the float properties value is left. That takes the image floats it to the left of its container, which is the paragraph, and then the rest of the content is moved up and over to align with the image. Finally, we've floated the image to the right of the content which comes after it in the paragraph. So as you would expect, if we look at the HTML, the image has a class attribute value of float right, and I'm sure you've guessed that we've set the float property to right. And in this example, we actually don't need the clear. We'll look at that in the next video. So if I save this page and go back to the browser, refresh, we'll see that the image, which comes before the text in the HTML paragraph, is now floated to the right. So it's aligned with the right side of the content display area. The text is moved up to the left because that is the area that's available for display inside of the parent paragraph element once the image is floated to the right. Now let's switch to our next example, which uses float and clear. This web page has 3 paragraphs, all of which contain 3 images and some text. In the first paragraph, we'll see that we've applied no float nor clear. So we see the 3 images in a row and the text in the same order that they are entered in the code. So looking at the code, we see the first image is Mount Washington, the second Adams, the third Jefferson, with the text that follows. So if I move my mouse over the image, we'll see this is Mount Washington, the first image in the paragraph, Adams, the second image in the paragraph, and finally Jefferson, followed directly by the text in the paragraph. Looking at the second paragraph, we'll see that I've applied a class of float1 to all 3 of the images. If we look at the float1 class, we see that the styles are float right, clear left. So what this does is it starts to display the content in the paragraph with the first image, and it floats it to the right, and it clears the display area to the left. So the next image that comes into play is Mount Adams, and because we've cleared the area to the left of the image that we just floated right, it takes the second image, it floats that to the right and clears left to make space for the third image, which follows the same pattern of floating right and clearing left to display the text. So if we look at this in the browser, we see that the first image displayed on the right is Mount Washington. The second image is Mount Adams, the third Jefferson. Now this is in reverse order of the way that the images are defined in the paragraph. But because we floated them right and then cleared left, we added the first image, then added the second image, then added the third image, cleared left, so that the text is able to be moved over to the left and up into the top of the display area. So again, we've floated the images right, we've cleared the area to their left. The final example is float right, clear right. So in this case, we'll take the first image, which again is Mount Washington, we'll float that to the right and clear to the right, so that when the next image comes into play, it's floated over to the right and the area to the right is cleared, where there's no more space, so that the third image, when it's floated to the right, moves all the way over to the right of the display area. We clear right, so that when the text is displayed, it's in the upper left-hand corner of the display area, because we've pushed all the images to the right by floating them and clearing to the right, so that there's no more display area left after the last image. So just looking at that code quickly, here are 3 images. They all have a class of float2. Expanding that, we'll see the float right and clear right. All right, so let's jump over to VS Code and take a look at our next example. So here we have a simple web page with 3 paragraph elements. Each element has a class attribute with a different value. So the first paragraph has a class attribute with the value of left, the second right, and the third obviously center. Looking over at the CSS for this file, we'll see that the left, right, and center classes are commented out. So if we load this page in the browser, we'll see the content displayed exactly the same way that it's declared in the HTML. First, we have the paragraph with the image of Mount Washington, then the paragraph with the image of Mount Adams, and finally the third paragraph with the text. So if we go back to VS Code and over to the CSS file, let's uncomment the first style. And what this does is it finds first all the paragraph elements on the page. But the dot left says, okay, of those paragraphs, find the one that has the class of left. So that is our first paragraph. Then take the paragraph and its content contained therein, float it left, and give it a width of 30% of the visible area. So if we go back to the browser now and refresh the page, now we see that Mount Washington is still the first element on the page, but it's floated to the left. And if we open up developer tools, and let's just resize this a little bit so we can work with it, can use the selector and hover over the paragraph, we'll see that it takes up 30% of the display area. Now if we go back to the code and uncomment out the next style, which is applied to the paragraph with the class of right, which is the second paragraph, go back to the browser after saving the code, refresh the page, and now we see the second image is floated all the way to the right. So we floated the first image to the left, we floated the second image to the right, and now we need to deal with the paragraph that has the text. So finally, uncommenting out the last style, we'll find the paragraph with the class of center, give it a margin left of 35, a margin right of 35. So this is going to give us margins around this paragraph for a bit better spacing between the image that is floated left and the image that is floated right. So saving these changes and going back to the browser, refresh the page, we see that the margins stay the same. As I shrink this, we still have those margins of 35% and 35% between the two images. The final example I'd like to look at in this video allows us to use CSS properties to display content in a grid. So here on the page, we see distinct sections of content with an image and the name of the mountain for that image. If we look at the code, we'll see that all of the content is contained within an unordered list with list items. So each list item has an image and the mountain's name. If we look at the CSS, in the body I've set the background color of the page to black. In the gallery item, I've set the background color to white so that we could distinguish between the different list items on the page. Each image, I've set the width, height, and I've given a padding and margin of 5 pixels. This CSS selector says find all the HTML elements on the page with a class of gallery. And in our case, there's really only one element that has a class of gallery. That's the unordered list. And then find within that element the list items. So each of these list items contained within the unordered list. Float each of those to the left. We defined a width and height, given it some padding, margin, and a thin dotted border. Also centered the content within the list item. The last thing I did of interest here is I've taken each of the list items, which because it's an unordered list would be a bulleted list, and I've set the list style to none to remove the bullet. So again, if we go back to the browser, right, this isn't displayed as a bulleted list. It looks like distinct divs with an image and a title in it. And if we resize the browser, the content is also adjusted to fit the viewable area on the page. So in this video, we used the CSS float and clear properties to position content on a web page. In the next video, we'll look at responsive CSS.